It's good. Is that working now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. All right. So, I mean, feel free to jump in and ask questions. Otherwise, there'll be, I guess, plenty of time for questions at the end. I'm just going to quickly, just moving myself on my own screen. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, so today I'll be talking about psychedelics in the pharmacology of consciousness. I should, before I launch in, just want to thank Hiro and Ryota for inviting me to give this talk. I think it's great that there's a little bit more. It's one of the positives coming out of COVID, I guess, that there's more of this international interaction, and it'd be great to, I'll now start coming to more of these consciousness talks. It'd be great to learn more about what's happening in Japan. Okay. So really the principal objective of my research is to better understand the neurobiological factors that support and influence consciousness. You know, I'm interested in how the brain generates my experience. It's as simple as that. But I've been working quite a bit with some philosophers out of Monash, and so people like Tim Bain they've drilled it into me that when you're talking about consciousness, you need to really be clear about what it is you're talking about, and it presupposes that there's clarity and agreement about the nature of conscious experience itself. So I realized that the field, there isn't this clarity and agreement, and so just before I launch into my talk, just to give a little sort of context of the way I conceive of consciousness. And for me, I actually think it's the most useful way of thinking about things is thinking of the word consciousness more of an umbrella term, that there's a lot of things that people use the word consciousness to refer to a lot of different things. I think that does not mean that there's a lack of definition. I don't think it means that consciousness is no longer testable. One analogy that I think is quite useful is something like running ability. If you had 10 different exercise physiologists in a room, they may disagree on who was the best runner in the world. And it's not because it's not possible to record exact sort of timing of speed or anything like that. It's that different people would be making those judgments based on very different sorts of factors. Is it to do with speed or endurance or all of, longevity, all of these different things that are perfectly measurable, but they're different. And I think it's important that we, as a field, start thinking more about the nuanced ways in which people use the word consciousness. So that's my sort of general feeling about the science of consciousness. And I actually think some of the work that I'll be talking about today really highlights this need to think more deeply about what it is we're talking about when we use words like consciousness, and thinking about levels of consciousness and measures of consciousness, what it is we're actually measuring. So this is without the psychedelic section up the top here, this slide is a figure that has been replicated many times in lots of different textbooks, different versions of the same thing. And basically, this is a general idea that consciousness itself, it really is one of, can be split along two dimensions. One is a general wakefulness or vigilance, and the other is some type of actual level of consciousness per se, or awareness. I mean, I'm struggling to find the words because the punchline of all of this is I think that this graph is not particularly helpful. But the work that I'm going to present today was really motivated by asking this question: is that are psychedelic states and meditation states, do they fit somewhere in this kind of conceptualization of consciousness, where it's somehow higher, some sort of higher state of consciousness, which is a term, these are terms that are often used in the popular press, that both meditation and psychedelics somehow lead to a higher state of consciousness, whereas quite clearly things like general anesthesia and coma lead to reductions in consciousness. It's unclear to what extent the science supports the idea that psychedelics may somehow be a higher state. And clinically, this motivation to try to find measures of consciousness makes a huge amount of sense. You know, it's important to be able to distinguish a patient that's in a coma or under a sort of general anesthetic that is genuinely unconscious of their surroundings versus other people that might sit in these classes here in the vegetative state, and the minimally conscious state. Hopefully you can see my cursor. I'm not sure if that pops up. Or the locked-in syndrome, which is a condition where people are fully aware of their surroundings, but they're also fully paralyzed and unable to communicate. So this need to be able to find biological markers of people's experience that doesn't require them to report their experience is really driving a lot of research at the moment. And I think it's an important pursuit. Just as one example, I know that there's people in this audience listening to this talk that will be extremely familiar with these types of analysis techniques, and other people that will have absolutely no idea. And that's fine. The point of this slide is to just capture one example of an attempt to find a brain correlate of what we call a level of consciousness. And it's based on this EEG measure, so electrical activity coming out of the brain after a strong magnetic pulse. And basically the EEG file, the data file coming out from the brain, the electrical signals coming out from the brain after this TMS pulse are then compressed. And the simple idea is that the more, the less complex the EEG signal, the less conscious the person is. So that's the simple sort of summary of this body of work. But what I want to really emphasize here is this is a figure that's in a prominent Nature Reviews neuroscience paper, and there's this dotted line across the middle, and this idea that, well, if you fall below this line, then you should be considered unconscious, and if you're above the line, you should be considered conscious and treated as such, and that there could be some clinically meaningful sort of consequences of how your brain is measured. And in a clinical setting, people might treat you differently if they consider you to be conscious versus unconscious. So where you fall on this line is important. If this is a valid measure of consciousness, that would be extremely useful. And it really does imply that there's a sort of gradation of conscious experience. So this talk that I'm going to present today is really trying to delve a little bit deeper into that and ask, well, is it appropriate to consider psychedelics a higher state? But also, hopefully, throughout this talk, I'll encourage everybody to really think about what it means to them to have something that would be a higher state of consciousness. What would it mean for you as an individual to be more conscious than you are at this moment? And this is actually something that, as Tim Bain and I were writing the paper that I'll talk about, just many times we came to thinking, what would it even mean to be more conscious than you are now? What would that feel like? What aspects of your current experience would change? It's quite easy to imagine, you know, every night we fall asleep and there is this sort of general sense that your sensory capacity is reduced, you become detached from your environment, and you gradually less and less conscious. But it's nowhere near as intuitive to think about what would it mean for you as a healthy person to somehow be more conscious than you are in this moment. Okay, so the two main questions we wanted to ask is, do psychedelics lead to a higher state of consciousness, and can understanding the perceptual and cognitive changes associated with the psychedelic state actually inform the science of consciousness? So I'm going to spend a few slides just to give a very brief overview of not exactly what we know about psychedelics, but really to give a sense of where the science is at the moment. Because I think people don't appreciate how much is actually understood when it comes to the psychedelic state. So first of all, we know a lot about the chemical structure of the psychedelic drugs. So here are the chemical structure of the serotonin up on the left, which is the natural occurring neurotransmitter that naturally flows around your brain. And three very sort of famous psychedelic drugs, LSD, DMT, and psilocin. And psilocin is the active metabolite of psilocybin, which is the compound I'll be talking about today. But they all share this same, one sort of component of their structure is very similar to the serotonin structure. And as you'll come to see in the next few slides, most of the effects of psilocybin are currently attributed to the serotonin system. So just also want to give a little bit of an overview of what we understand in terms of the neuroanatomy of the different pharmacological systems. Again, we really do know quite a lot about the, I guess, the pathways in the brain that mediate the large pharmacological changes that happen naturally all the time. So here I've just shown the pathways associated with acetylcholine, dopamine, noradrenaline, and serotonin. And in the middle here, that's all of these things overlaid. And the take home from this slide, if you've never sort of been exposed to the neuropharmacology, is that, first of all, these networks are highly distributed. So you have neurons that release dopamine and serotonin and noradrenaline all over the brain. But the other point is that the cell bodies of these different neurotransmitter systems are all localized relatively sort of densely within the brainstem or the middle parts of the brain. And what that means is that you can end up with relatively coordinated, large global brain changes. So the impact of the serotonin system will impact the dopamines and so forth. So you end up with this capacity for the brain state to be radically sort of shifted from one state, for want of a better word, things like in dropping off to sleep, the release of these neurotransmitter systems changes drastically in high stress states where everything's pumping through your body and you're highly alert. Again, there's a huge flood of neurotransmitters throughout the brain, coordinating these global changes across the cortex. Okay, so just to reorient, so that in terms of the psychedelic drugs, they act mainly on the serotonin pathways. And in terms of the serotonin pathways, this slide here is meant to be very overwhelming. So don't worry about all the different little parts. Here it's more to illustrate that actually the science of the different receptor locations and the functions of the different serotonin receptors is also really well understood. I mean, there's still work ongoing, but you know, I've identified in the order of around 20 different serotonin receptor subtypes, and it's relatively well understood where those different receptor subtypes are located in the brain, and also on the different locations in different types of cells. So here you have, I've highlighted the 5-HT1A receptor. Now didn't get around to saying that serotonin is abbreviated as the 5-HT. So of these 20 odd serotonin neurons, there's two main receptor types that are primarily activated by the psilocybin, so the psychedelic drugs. So one is the serotonin 1A receptor, and that's an autoreceptor, which means that the autoreceptor means that it's sensitive to, it sort of helps mediate the further release of serotonin. So in this case, if serotonin, or if that receptor is activated, what it actually does is shut down the release of serotonin from the big serotonin neurons. So it has this sort of counterintuitive effect, or not, that activating that actually shuts down the natural serotonin being released. And the serotonin 2A receptors are found in these sort of postsynaptic zones. So the main point of this slide is really just to stress, though, is how much is understood in terms of which are the receptors that are activated, where do those receptors sit in the relative to the different neurons, and just to also emphasize that these drugs are highly selective. So not only do they not just activate all the serotonin receptors, they just really activate these two main serotonin receptors, they also are not activating all the dopamine and noradrenaline neurons. So it's what's, I think, really interesting about these drugs is that the drugs that seem to really impact the conscious state, so, you know, all the drugs that are the main, the sort of famous psychedelic hallucination causing drugs, seem to activate just this very small number of receptors, the serotonin 1A and 2A receptors. And most of the drugs that activate those receptors cause hallucinations. So if you're interested in studying consciousness, then this is a really, I think, promising tool to try to manipulate the brain processes that might be really central to conscious experience. So I'll zip through this a bit faster, but again, just to say that we know that the 2A receptors that are not found all over the brain, they're found predominantly in the pyramidal cells. So this is a particular type of neuron in a particular part of the cortex. There's now a number of different models that are being proposed. This is a very recent paper just a few weeks ago that's come out making quite specific claims about the different components of an individual cell and their role in the psychedelic pathways, that distinguishing psychedelics from other drugs like ketamine. So again, you don't have to worry about the details here, but just to say that there are a lot of people working on these details. And so we actually have a really good handle of what's happening in the brain. And finally, there's now quite a lot of work looking at large-scale brain imaging, and that is often just showing that this particular study, which is the study referenced down here by Catherine Preller and Adele Rezi, and they've looked at different changes in cortical activity and actually found increased disintegration, so reduced integration of information processing in these corticostriatal thalamic circuits. And they've linked those to what is known about the expression of the 2A receptors in the cortex. So these types of pretty detailed studies are going on at the moment, and they're in parallel to this huge body of work that's coming out looking at the psychedelic drugs for treatment of different psychiatric conditions. So treatment for depression, treatment for anxiety, these sorts of things. So the work that I'm doing and my interest is less related to treatment of current clinical disorders and much more interested in what can we learn about consciousness itself from the effects of these drugs. So I'm now going to move away from the neuro sort of biology and really want to stress the now just really jump into the phenomenology, so the experience of the psychedelic state, because as I said, you know, my interest is largely consciousness itself. So what this image is just a screenshot of me. I Googled something along the lines of psychedelic art in Google Images. And what you see is this, you just get thousands and thousands of images that look quite a lot like this. And the critical point is that, you know, they're very unusual sorts of images, but they're not random. You know, I expect that most of you would not be surprised to hear that these are the sorts of images that came up when I Googled psychedelic art. And So yeah, so there's some really interesting sorts of, well, I say patterns. In some cases it is actual patterns, and others is just this, there's a clear emphasis of these very striking colors. Often people use the term psychedelic colors itself. And also the other point is that the images are not always pleasant. So, you know, this image in the middle here with these, the monkeys and the skulls or whatever they are, not necessarily always a pleasant state, but I just think, I always think it's important to stress that when sometimes now in the therapeutic context, people are making it sound like psychedelics always lead to this fantastic awakening and improved mental health state. Not necessarily always the case. But it's the non-randomness that I think is most interesting in terms of a scientific tool. Now, what I have here is, this is just a visual illusion. So hopefully you're all seeing this. If you move your eyes around the screen, you'll see this sense of motion. And, you know, they understand a little bit, the biology of this illusion is understood as well. And I'm not claiming that the drugs act in the same way, but rather to say that the experience induced by this sort of illusion is actually a really good illustration of the sorts of experiences that people have on, I'll say, a low dose drug, psilocybin treatment. And particularly this idea that there's these sorts of qualities in an experience that somehow don't make logical sense. And so, for example, in this case, there's a clear sense of motion. Hopefully you're experiencing that. But at the same time, it's very clear to you as an observer that the pieces themselves, the individual items themselves, are not moving. So you get a sense of motion without any movement. And there's a lot of examples of those sorts of experiences on the psychedelic state where there's a feeling of an actual experience of color, like here you're getting an experience of motion, but at the same time the person could tell that this is color on a white wall, for example, and that the wall itself is actually white, despite also seeing color. So it's this sort of quite hard to capture these experiences. Okay, so I'm going to move into talking a little bit about the actual study that we did, and it focused on two approaches, and it was really trying to capture what is the nature of the psychedelic state in healthy people, not in clinical populations, and does that psychedelic state, can it be reasonably considered higher than a normal conscious state? That was the kind of question. And we looked at two main types of data, and one is this subjective rating scales, so really questionnaires, and the other was more objective sort of computer-based tasks that I'll take you through slowly what we did. So in terms of the questionnaires, the data that we used was from this, it's called the 5D Altered States of Consciousness rating scale. And depending on when, you know, at some point while these experiments were going on, the questionnaire was expanded to 94 items, but most of this comes back to the 60 main items. And there are all these types of questions. I saw brightness or flashes of light when my eyes were closed or when it was complete darkness. I felt one with my surroundings. Worries and anxieties of everyday life felt unimportant. The person was simply asked to write not more than usual or yes, much more than usual. So if all things were normal, they just said they would mark down at this not more than usual end. Okay, and what this group, the Franz Vollenweider's group in Switzerland, so they have done a huge number of studies, and I think actually the number of studies that have been done is not well appreciated. There's a sense that psychedelic research is just started over the last few years, but the group in Switzerland has done a huge number of studies here. This is the work that I'll be talking about reflects a cluster analysis that was based on 327 different psilocybin sessions. These are all healthy people. So it's really, that's a lot of sessions in a lab control environment, giving people these psychedelic drugs, and they split them into low dose, medium dose, or high doses. And they ran this cluster analysis on the different subjective, those sorts of questionnaires that I just went through. And you end up with these different primary features, the experience of unity, spiritual experience, blissful state, insightfulness, disembodiment, impaired cognition and control, anxiety, complex imagery, elementary imagery, and audiovisual synesthesia, and the change meaning of percepts. So I'll talk more about those key things that have been pulled out in this cluster analysis. So what this figure shows, I think this is actually a really important figure. This is a summary of all that same sort of cluster analysis, basically, of these different features, and these are the features I just read out. And what it shows on the left here is all of the data grouped together from the psilocybin experiments, and on the right is from ketamine. So ketamine, if you've never heard of ketamine, ketamine is it's an anesthetic drug that is used it's used in a lot of animal research, and it's used still in wartime conditions and things, because it's relatively hard, impossible to cause someone to have a sort of cardiac arrest so it's relatively safe in terms of anesthesia when you've got animals or people in a battlefield and you can't control the dose relatively well. But it's not used extensively in anesthesia because it causes hallucinations. So there's now increasing work looking at ketamine. It acts very differently to psilocybin. It causes very different types of experiences, and that's actually the main point of this feature here, is that it induces clearly altered states of experience, but ones that are clearly distinguishable from the psilocybin state. So in the ketamine state, it's more around physical disembodiment, and if you look over on the psilocybin state, it's much more visual and audiovisual synesthesia and these types of things. So this is an important thing, that it's not just messing up in this indiscriminate way. It's not just messing up your experience so that you're confused and can't say anything sensible about it. It's causing a selective sort of type of effect that's distinguishable from other unusual altered states of consciousness. In this case, it's distinguishable from the ketamine state, and also that this shows drug dose selectivity. So if you want to look at this as a kind of experimental manipulation, you want to know that, well, is that the drug, if you give more of the drug, do you get more of the effect? And yes, you do. So it just shows that there's a little bit of control, I guess, in terms of the type of manipulation of brain function that's caused by these drugs. Okay, so I'll just keep moving along here. So I'll come back to those types of summary effects that came from the questionnaire data. But just to say that I'm also going to talk about some more objective lab-based work, and some of this work relates to work that I did during my PhD a few years ago now. I did my PhD at the University of Queensland, but the work was done physically in Switzerland. So I went to Switzerland for a couple of years and worked in the lab of Franz Vollenweider, and it's his group that did all those 300 odd tested those participants that have the subjective data. Okay, so I'll take you through these types of lab-based objective studies, just to say some of them was work from that I was involved in, and others is work that other people have been involved in. But there is, just to make the point, that there is quite a lot of detailed objective type of psychophysical assessments that have been done of the psychedelic state. Okay, so in terms of it, just to give you a sense, the typical study design in the study that I did, this was quite typical of the work that was being done in Switzerland. We had I did 2 different studies. In the first one, there was 12 healthy volunteers, and each person did 3 different drug conditions on 3 totally different days. And it'd either be placebo, in this case, low dose or high dose. And what I've shown here is just, this is from a different study, but just showing the average time course of psilocybin in the blood, basically. So at around 90 minutes, this is someone's consumed a tablet in this case, and around 90 minutes, there's the peak blood concentration. And there's really a pretty sort of high levels of psilocybin circulating from about 1 hour through to 180 minutes, so around 3 hours. And it's in that period that we would be running tests of people and give people that psychological rating scale at around 3 hours, so that they could reflect back on the previous sort of 2 hours of the experience. And just to give you a sense, so we had, it wasn't in this particular lab, it wasn't that there were candles everywhere and that type of thing, but it was just more like a comfortable living room. And it was in a nice location, so people could look out into a nice sort of forest, but it was otherwise just a simple sort of office room. We had computers to test people. And just, I like to give this one anecdote that to give you a sense of the types of experiences people had. So not only did people often, I'm just highlighting, if you can see this down, the picture with the plant at the bottom of the screen with the girl looking out of the window. It was very, very common for people to experience that sort of motion in this plant that I showed in the example of the motion illusion. And if there was ever any music going on, the plant looked as if it was sort of dancing to the music. But of course, this is this weird experience where, of course, it's not dancing, but it somehow looks like it's dancing. And in one case, one of the participants made me physically take the plant out of the room because it looked like it was giving the impression that the plant had bad intentions. So again, the person was like, I realize it's a plant, but it's giving me the creeps and I can't concentrate because I feel like it has some bad intentions. It's somehow going to hurt me. So there's these really quite profound changes in your subjective experience caused by these drugs. And certainly with eyes closed or even looking at surfaces around you, people would report quite strong sort of senses of motion, like the walls were moving or there strong colors in the walls. One of the people doing the study actually was looking at the effects of after images, like color after images, which many of this audience might be familiar with. And that is a very common type of report, that almost like color after images on the walls. Okay, but I'll move along. So what we were interested to do is say, can we learn anything from this data that's out there in terms of the nature of the psychedelic state? Can we use that data to actually inform current theories of consciousness science? We've got a lot of consciousness research really emphasizes the perceptual side of things, the color intensity, these sorts of things. Other consciousness theories really emphasize the functional or the cognitive aspects of consciousness, the global workspace. There's almost a separate body of research that's really interested in the role of the self in consciousness. And then the work that I mentioned before in terms of these discussions of whether it's appropriate to think about consciousness as a multidimensional construct or something that can be ordered, that one person or one state can be higher or lower in consciousness than another. Okay, so the question is, can we use the psychedelic state to inform any of these lines of research? And so the question, what I'm going to show you here is really the way we approached it was to go through each of these things here. So we've got perception, cognitive function, and self-immunity. And then to kind of ask the question, what would it mean for you to consider that there's more consciousness, or that somehow consciousness has been increased, or that's a higher state of consciousness in respect to perception, and then we'll look at cognition, and then we'll look at self. Okay, so if we're starting of perception, and I actually think for those of you listening to actually even just think to yourself, what would it mean to you? What do you think you would need to change in terms of your own current experience for you to have more or less sensory experience? So is it a question that you have more like a greater volume of content that's coming into you at any one moment? Is somehow a greater intensity of experience? Like, what is it that we would be looking for? It's not even clear to me what it is that we might be looking for. But anyway, in terms of what the data from the psychedelic state is, that we see really clearly that there people do endorse, there are these statements: I saw colors before me in total darkness or with my eyes closed. And this is just a sort of section of that graph I showed earlier. And yeah, people are saying that consistently people are seeing colors when there is actual total darkness. So I've given that a tick because the existence of clear, detailed sort of phenomenology when there would normally be less so seems to be something that would be consistent with more consciousness. Again, this is just a more complex kind of scene. So I saw scenes rolling by in total darkness or with eyes closed, and my imagination was extremely vivid. That somehow seems to be a richer experience. So I've given that a tick for what it's worth. And here's this question mark: like, things around me had a new strange meaning for me. Things started to change their meaning. That's an interesting one, because on the one hand, it's like a cup, here I've got a cup, and what does it mean for it to have a new strange meaning? And is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? This is where it's quite interesting actually thinking about all these states and what is consciousness and what is it for. So it's not really clear that if objects that you otherwise know have they changed their meaning, whether that's a good or a positive or have anything at all to do with more or less consciousness. Oops, sorry. And in terms of the lab-based experiments, we see quite consistently that there is evidence for reduced sensory inhibition, reduced sensory gating. So what that means is it's experiments like backward masking, those sorts of experiments, if you're familiar with those sorts of things, where there's often a lot of sensory filtering. We don't experience everything in the world sort of at any one moment. And it seems that type of gating mechanisms are reduced on the psychedelic state. Saccade frequencies increase, so people are moving their eyes around more. So those two things are certainly in the line of suggesting, well, maybe more information is getting into the brain, in filling our conscious experience with somehow more information, more sensory information. I think it's important to note that even though people very regularly report heightened sort of intensity of color experience, increased brightness, if you sit someone down in a lab type of experiment, they don't actually perform any better. They're not able to detect lower sort of contrast differences, and the hue discrimination is similar. It's certainly not better. If anything, it's worse, despite the fact that people experience their hue, their color sensation as being much, much better. Okay, I really quickly take you through. This is the sort of study that was done. And so really basic type of contrast sensitivity task. So on the top here, you just see a grading image that's moving to the left or to the right. And as the contrast decreases, it becomes, you can't see it anymore. And the task is always to say, is this image moving to the left or to the right? And the point is, despite things seeming brighter, people are no better at this task. If anything, they're slightly worse. I see I've left off the legend for this figure. So the gray is the psilocybin state, and on the left is the pretest, and 120 minutes is basically the peak drug effect. And this middle graph B is coherence, motion coherence. So what you do find is that on the drugs, people are much worse at integrating these different signals. So in a normal non-drug state, if you have lots of dots moving left or right, and then you start adding random dots, the brain is very good at just grouping the dots moving coherently, and you end up getting an experience of coherence, sort of like a transparent film, sort of moving across over a background of noisy dots. And if you add more and more randomly moving dots, then that task becomes harder and harder, and you can't tell what direction things are going. And that is really impaired on the psilocybin. And the way people report that experience is that normally what the person, their sensory system does is basically inhibit all the background random dots. And on the case of the drugs, the ability to inhibit those distracting components is really reduced. So then the signal itself of the coherently moving dots is much, much harder to see. So basically the noise signal is amplified. Okay, but all of this is just to give you a deep dive into a type of study you might do with someone on a psychedelic state that shows that actually in terms of contrast detection, in terms of the sensitivity of the individual signal, they're not changed in any way, but maybe their ability to inhibit or suppress other information is reduced. So maybe there is actually more getting in to consciousness at any time. All right, so moving along. Now looking at the cognition side of things, and this relates to things like attention and memory and reportability, might be highly relevant to models of things like the global workspace theory. And what was interesting, actually, I didn't remember this from the surveys when I gave people these surveys as a student, that even the wording of the questions are in the negative. So in terms of cognitive control, it's not, I felt like I could concentrate better, yes or no. It was, I had difficulty making even the smallest decisions. I had difficulty distinguishing important from unimportant things. I was not able to complete a thought. My thought repeatedly became disconnected. So even when the surveys were being written 20 years ago, it was clear to the people writing the surveys that the types of effects on these memory and sort of attentional functions seem to be impaired. So they're all written in the negative, and people endorse that they had these difficulties with the concentration. And in terms of the lab-based sorts of studies, there was objectively impaired speech production. The complexity of the language being produced was reduced. In the case of my studies, I only speak English, so all of the participants had to communicate with me in English, but most of them were native. It was in Switzerland. They spoke German or French, and they were all fluent in English, but under the effects of the drugs, a lot of them had a huge amount of trouble talking in English and had to often to get the German research assistants or the postdocs in the group to translate. So that was something that was really clear just in the studies that I wasn't testing it directly, but people really have trouble finding the right words on the psychedelic while they're on psychedelics. And in terms of attention and working memory, there's clear data showing that there's impaired divided attention and selective attention. Things like sustained attention seem to be unaffected, and actually working memory and other things, again, it's not better, but it seems to be sort of the same unless the person gets distracted, is basically the summary. Now, oh yeah, sorry, I thought I had a different thing to say. No, but so continuing on with the sort of cognition side of things, people also report in the I guess in the popular press and blogs and things when they talk about psychedelic states, there's a lot of reports that psychedelics might increase creativity or insight. And there was a whole cluster around insight, and there's a lot to do with subjective experiences I felt very profound. I gained clarity into connections that puzzled me before. I had very original thoughts. And these are some other types of statements that were endorsed. Everything around me was happening so fast that I no longer could follow what was going on. I had difficulty in distinguishing important from unimportant things, and conflicts and contradictions seemed to dissolve. So there's this funny kind of disconnection here where I've said here, well, these drugs, maybe they increase original or novel thoughts, but it's unclear whether these original thoughts are objectively useful in any way. Certainly in the few studies so far that have come out and really looking at creativity in terms of speech, they found that the tests in people's communication, they would talk in much more tangential ways, so that in terms of objectively, that they were saying things that were unusual and novel, but they weren't considered to be correct or particularly insightful. So there's an interesting thing where there's a sensation of greater clarity and insight that has yet to be demonstrated in sort of objective measures. And in terms of, so just to say sort of overall, it seems like the cognitive capacity and working memory are probably not improved by these drugs, and maybe, if anything, impaired. In terms of experiences of self and unity, which are also important in theories of consciousness, I think this is actually a really interesting finding, is that there seems to be a real increase in the sense of unity and a breakdown of traditional sort of self-other boundaries. So people report everything seemed to unify into one. It seemed to me that my environment and I were one. I experienced a touch of eternity. So time seems to be connected. The now and forever is all sort of merged into one. Conflicts and contradictions seem to dissolve. So even conceptual sort of ideas, conflicting concepts seem to merge into one. They seem to dissolve. And I experience past, present, and future as oneness. So I think that this is all actually really interesting, that it seems to be breaking down these boundaries. In terms of lab-based studies, so psychophysics, find that in very short intervals, like if you're doing temporal types of judgments, if they're short tasks, they're unimpaired. They're not better, but they're basically the same. But if it's longer intervals that are requiring people to make judgments about time of more than 2 seconds or so, things are impaired. And images like this, these types of figures where you normally see these, I guess, binding between the different circles, and you see this illusory contrast down the edges of the triangle, that seems to be reduced under these effects. All right. So in summary, to sort of capture this, in terms of thinking about whether the psychedelic state could be considered as somehow higher or enhanced or better in terms of consciousness, coming at it from all these different ways that people think about consciousness, we concluded, so Tim and I concluded, that maybe there is some evidence that perception is somehow enhanced, or that maybe it's richer, or it's less sensory filtering, less inhibition. But in terms of cognition, it's, if anything, it's quite clearly impaired under the psychedelic state. And in terms of unity, so there really is this, the psychedelic state highly impacts this experience of unity and self. What's not clear, why there's a question mark, is how does that, what would current theories of consciousness say about that? Is it enhancement if the sense of self is dissolved? You know, if one thing that consciousness is trying to do is give us a sense of self, then is it a positive that our sense of self somehow is merging self and time and space, and now is sort of merging with everything else? That somehow doesn't seem to be a positive. But on the same time, that experience the intensity of self and connected to others does seem to be enhanced. So it sort of depends on how you look at it. Okay, so what we sort of came away to think about is that, well, it doesn't really support the idea that you could put neatly the psychedelics up the top here, that neatly you just go from a coma through to sort of light sleep and drowsiness to wakefulness to psychedelics, that there's this neat line. It doesn't seem to support that view. And I think that's actually important, that a paper came out soon after our paper that was actually claiming that maybe we can give psychedelics to people in coma and in vegetative state. And I think that the data here argues against that idea. Certainly if cognitive impacts of brain damage, if you're exacerbating those things or causing increased anxiety, it's unclear to me that a drug like psychedelics would help someone that's in a vegetative state, but that has yet to be tested. Okay, so in terms of, I'm nearly finished, in terms of lessons for consciousness science, I think it is not so much that this data has anything specific to say about the current measures of complexity or entropy or integrated information theory, but the one thing that all of these approaches to consciousness have in common is that they all assume a total ordering. The IIT, you have the phi value or the entropy, the complexity measures, this idea that you can take an analysis of a brain or an artificial system, you could compute the entropy or the complexity or the integrated information theory, and you could put someone on a graph of is that entity more or less conscious than a different entity, or is that current state, the person's in sleep or not sleep, more or less conscious. And hopefully one thing that we're hoping to achieve through this work is to say we really need to think much more about what it is that dot on the graph, or what that number of IIT value is actually referring to. If we've got cognitive capacity moving in one direction, if we've got sensory complexity going in a different direction, is it that IIT and other measures are just capturing sensory richness and nothing to do at all with any of the other sorts of components of a psychedelic state? I think that's really important, that we get better at saying what is it that we're trying to measure. And if we have someone in a hospital bed that we're trying to record from their brain and say, what state is this person in? If the person has no capacity to remember or make sense of their environment, but they're having a very rich sensory state, we really need to know that, sort of what are they able to do with their phenomenal experience. Okay, in terms of global availability, the global workspace theory, that theory really does rely on this, or emphasize this ability, this relationship, I'll read it out, between a cognitive system and specific object of thought. So it's as if these objects appear to be sort of selected for further processing and then used in verbal or non-verbal report and behavior. And it seems that under the psychedelic state, this is one thing that actually breaks down, is that people do seem to be more impacted by their sensory environment, but possibly less able to use that sensory information in any sort of functional way. Actual capacity to report seems to be impaired as well. In terms of self-monitoring or metacognition, it's also, one quote is that another meaning of consciousness is reflexive. It refers to self-referential relationships in which the cognitive system is able to monitor its own processing and obtain information about itself. So again, this drug seems to break down that capacity, because it seems to reduce the ability for the system, the self, to actually distinguish between self and other, which seems to be its primary purpose, you would think. And I also think it's interesting in terms of evolutionary models of consciousness. So people, take psychedelics and hallucinogenic drugs for recreational purposes and for clinical purposes. They feel like it's beneficial to them. So I think that's really interesting, and we need to explore these, the sort of benefits of these drugs, but also it is important to think about the psychedelic acute state when you're on these drugs. I mean, I for one would certainly not want my babysitter, if I had employed someone to come and look after my children, I found out they were taking a psychedelic drug at the same time, I'd be terrified or horrified. It doesn't seem like these drugs improve the ability to manage the sorts of things that are critically important for evolutionary success. So from an evolutionary angle, again, it's hard to see how the psychedelic state is helpful. So only just 2 more slides to go. So in terms of future directions, I have this image here, which is pulled out from an opinion paper by Tim Bain and Jakob Hui and Adrian Owen, that are really just making this point that maybe need to be thinking more about dimensions of consciousness. And in their paper, they really just talk about dimension A, B, C, D, and E. And one thing I think this work shows is that we might be at a point where we can start actually putting some detail into these. Well, what would dimension A and B and C? I've just made some up here. Maybe self-representation, accuracy, maybe intensity of contents. I'm not sure. And maybe here we need to start thinking about different types of experiences like mind wandering or meditation and such things. Just to really quickly thank the people involved. So this work was done. So there's a picture of my late PhD supervisor who passed away a couple of years ago. And because a lot of the work I was presenting was related back to my PhD work. And then more recently, bringing this all together with Tim Bain from Monash. And finally, I'll give a plug to the Melbourne Monash Consciousness Research Group, which is trying to do something vaguely similar to the Tokyo group. So hopefully we'll try and get some talks going. But if you're interested in these things, feel free to join up that as well. Okay, but now I'm done.